At 68, Margaret Sullivan had grown accustomed to being invisible. The woman who once commanded attention simply by entering a room now found herself overlooked in grocery stores, dismissed by bank tellers, and patronized by family members who spoke about her as if she weren't present. 2 years of widowhood had taught her that society viewed elderly women as burdens to be managed rather than people to be respected. "Mom, you really need to start taking better care of yourself," her daughter-in-law Jennifer said, settling into the worn floral armchair that had been Harold's favorite spot. At 35, Jenny possessed the kind of confident authority that came from managing other people's problems professionally. As office manager at Riverside Family Practice, she dealt with medical crises daily. Margaret poured tea from the china set Harold had given her for their 40th anniversary, her hands steady despite Jenny's concerned scrutiny. "I take perfectly good care of myself, dear." "That's what worries us," Jenny continued, accepting the delicate cup with manicured fingers. "You're so independent, so stubborn about accepting help. At your age, that kind of pride can be dangerous." Margaret had heard this speech before, variations delivered by well-meaning friends and relatives who couldn't understand why a widow in her late 60s insisted on maintaining her own household, managing her own finances, making her own decisions. "Michael and I have been talking," Jenny said, pulling out her phone to check messages with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to multitasking. "We think it's time you had a complete medical evaluation, just to establish baseline health metrics for someone your age. I had my annual physical 4 months ago. Dr. Peterson said I'm in excellent health." "Dr. Peterson is a general practitioner," Jenny replied dismissively. "He's not equipped to identify age-related deterioration in someone with your risk factors." Risk factors. Margaret wondered what risks Jenny imagined she possessed beyond the universal hazard of growing older in a society that equated age with incompetence. "What kind of deterioration are you concerned about?" Jenny's expression shifted into professional mode. The same focused attention Margaret had seen her use when discussing insurance claims and treatment protocols with Michael. Joint deterioration, cognitive decline, balance issues, the kinds of problems that develop gradually until they become crisis situations. "I haven't experienced any of those issues." "That's exactly the problem, Mom. By the time seniors notice symptoms, significant damage has already occurred. Prevention requires early intervention." Early intervention. The phrase sounded rehearsed, like something from a medical textbook or pharmaceutical advertisement. Margaret had noticed Jenny using more clinical language recently, speaking with the confidence of someone who'd absorbed medical knowledge through professional exposure. "I've already scheduled an appointment with a specialist," Jenny announced, producing a business card from her purse. "Dr. Richard Hayes. He specializes in age-related orthopedic issues, very well regarded in the senior care community." Margaret studied the elegant business card with its embossed lettering and expensive paper stock. Dr. Richard Hayes, orthopedic surgery. The address indicated a practice in the medical district downtown, the kind of prestigious location that suggested either exceptional expertise or exceptional marketing budgets. "I appreciate your concern, Jenny, but I'm quite capable of managing my own health care." "Are you, though?" Jenny's voice carried a sharp edge that hadn't been there moments before. "When's the last time you researched current medical best practices? When did you last review treatment options for age-related conditions? Medical knowledge advances constantly, Mom. What seemed adequate 5 years ago might be dangerously outdated today." The criticism stung because it contained enough truth to be effective. Margaret had indeed become less engaged with medical developments since Harold's death. Grief had consumed her attention for months, leaving little energy for staying current with healthcare innovations or preventive strategies. "Dr. Hayes has an opening next Tuesday," Jenny continued, her tone softening back to concerned daughter-in-law. "I've already verified that your insurance will cover the consultation. It's just an assessment, nothing invasive. But getting professional guidance about maintaining your health and mobility could prevent serious problems down the road." Margaret found herself nodding agreement. though something about Jenny's presentation felt uncomfortably orchestrated. The seamless transition from expressing concern to scheduling appointments suggested planning that preceded their conversation. "Your father waited too long to address his health issues," Jenny added quietly. "I'd hate to see you make the same mistake." Harold's final months had been marked by declining mobility and increasing dependence, exactly the kind of deterioration Margaret was determined to avoid. If preventive medical care could help her maintain independence, perhaps Jenny's concerns weren't entirely misplaced. "What does Michael think about this appointment?" "He's the one who suggested it," Jenny replied, checking her phone again. "He's been worried about you living alone in this big house, managing everything by yourself. We both think professional medical guidance could help you age more successfully." Age more successfully. Another clinical phrase that reduced the complex experience of growing older to a series of medical interventions and lifestyle modifications. Margaret wondered when aging had become a problem requiring professional management, rather than a natural process requiring adaptation. "I suppose one consultation wouldn't hurt," she said finally. "Have you ever felt pressured by family into medical decisions you didn't want? Comment your experience below." Jenny's smile seemed disproportionately bright for such a minor concession. "Wonderful. I'll confirm the appointment and arrange transportation. Dr. Hayes prefers family members to accompany senior patients to initial consultations. Better continuity of care when everyone's informed about treatment recommendations." Treatment recommendations. For conditions that hadn't been diagnosed by a physician Margaret had never met, the assumption that treatment would be necessary, regardless of the consultation's findings, struck her as premature. "I'm perfectly capable of driving myself to medical appointments." "Of course you are," Jenny agreed quickly. "But having family support during medical consultations helps ensure nothing important gets overlooked." Dr. Hayes specifically mentioned that senior patients sometimes forget to ask crucial questions or misunderstand complex medical information. Complex medical information. As if Margaret's 68 years of life experience had somehow diminished her ability to comprehend medical explanations or advocate for her own health needs. After Jenny left, Margaret sat in her quiet living room considering the conversation's undertones. Her daughter-in-law's concern felt genuine, but the level of organization, scheduled appointments, insurance verification, transportation arrangements, suggested preparation that preceded their discussion. The leather of Harold's chair still held the impression of his body, and she ran her fingers along the worn armrest where his hand had rested during countless evenings of shared silence and understanding. The house settled around her with familiar creaks and sighs, sounds that had once represented security, but now seemed to emphasize her isolation. Perhaps she was being paranoid, reading conspiracy into what might simply be efficient family care. The cool air from the heating vent above her carried the faint scent of the lavender sachets she'd placed in Harold's clothing before donating it. Reminders of a life built together that others now seemed determined to dismantle piece by piece. Jenny's professional background in medical office management would naturally make her more proactive about healthcare planning. Her suggestions might reflect genuine expertise rather than hidden agendas. Still, something about the interaction troubled Margaret. The assumption that she needed managed rather than consulted, the implication that her judgment was somehow compromised by age, the seamless progression from concern to scheduled appointment. She retrieved Dr. Hayes's business card from where Jenny had left it on the coffee table. The cardstock felt expensive, the design elegant but somehow impersonal. No personal touches, no indication of the physician's approach to patient care or medical philosophy. Margaret had learned to research significant decisions carefully, a habit developed during decades of marriage to Harold, who'd taught her the importance of understanding complex situations before committing to courses of action. Tomorrow, she would investigate Dr. Richard Hayes and his practice, just as she would research any major purchase or important decision. If Jenny was right about preventive medical care, the consultation might indeed prove valuable. But if her concerns were misplaced, Margaret wanted to understand Dr. Hayes's qualifications and approach before placing her health in his hands. For now, she would keep an open mind while gathering information independently. At 68, she'd earned the right to make informed decisions about her own body and medical care, regardless of what others might consider appropriate for someone her age. The appointment was still 5 days away. Plenty of time to learn what she needed to know about Dr. Richard Hayes and decide whether his consultation would genuinely serve her interests or merely satisfy her family's need to feel they were managing her care appropriately. Outside her window, the afternoon light was fading into the gentle darkness of early evening. Margaret made herself a simple dinner and settled into Harold's chair with a book, grateful for the peace of her own company and the comfort of making her own choices, however small they might seem to others. Tuesday morning arrived with the crisp efficiency of a scheduled obligation. Jenny had insisted on driving, claiming concern about Margaret's reaction time in medical district traffic, an issue Margaret had never experienced, but which Jenny discussed as established fact. Dr. Hayes runs a very prompt schedule, Jenny explained as they navigated downtown streets. He's quite particular about punctuality. It shows respect for medical professionals. Margaret studied her daughter-in-law's profile, noting the tension around her eyes that suggested anxiety about something beyond simple appointment logistics. Jenny's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, and she'd checked her phone 3 times during the 15-minute drive. "Are you feeling all right, dear? You seem nervous." "Just focused," Jenny replied quickly. "I want everything to go smoothly. First impressions matter with physicians like Dr. Hayes." Physicians like Dr. Hayes. As if Margaret had never interacted with medical professionals, never navigated healthcare systems, never made important medical decisions. The condescension felt sharper in the enclosed space of the car. Dr. Hayes's office occupied the ground floor of a gleaming medical complex that suggested expensive overhead and premium pricing. The waiting room featured leather furniture, abstract artwork, and that particular combination of vanilla air freshener and antiseptic that marked spaces designed to mask clinical atmospheres rather than embrace them. Margaret signed in at a reception desk staffed by young women whose smiles seemed professionally calibrated. The intake forms requested extensive information about insurance coverage, family medical history, and financial responsibility, more documentation than she'd expected for a routine consultation. "First visit with Dr. Hayes?" the receptionist asked brightly. "He's wonderful with senior patients, very thorough, very understanding about age-related concerns." Age-related concerns. Another phrase that reduced the complexity of individual health to simple categories based on chronological age rather than actual symptoms or functional capacity. "Mrs. Sullivan?" A nurse wearing scrubs decorated with cartoon characters called her name from an inner doorway. "Dr. Hayes is ready to see you." Dr. Richard Hayes appeared to be in his early 50s, with silver-touched hair and the kind of confident bearing that suggested success in his profession. His office walls displayed medical degrees, board certifications, and photographs of himself with various dignitaries, the standard credentials portfolio of a physician building a reputation. "So, Margaret," he began, apparently unaware that she preferred her full name, "I understand you're experiencing some mobility concerns." "Actually, I'm not experiencing any mobility concerns," Margaret corrected gently. "My daughter-in-law scheduled this appointment based on her observations, not my complaints." Something flickered across Dr. Hayes's expression, a momentary calculation before his professional smile returned. "Of course. Preventive assessment is always wise. At your age, early intervention can prevent serious complications." He moved to his computer, pulling up what appeared to be preloaded information about her medical history. "I've reviewed your insurance coverage. Excellent benefits. Your policy covers comprehensive orthopedic assessment and intervention with minimal patient responsibility." Margaret found it odd that he'd reviewed her insurance before examining her or even discussing her supposed health concerns. In her experience, competent physicians focused on medical issues before considering financial arrangements. Let's get some baseline X-rays, Dr. Hayes continued, signaling to his nurse. Standard protocol for patients in your demographic. Patients in your demographic. She wondered what demographic that might be. Elderly women? Recent widows? People with comprehensive insurance coverage? The X-ray process felt unnecessarily extensive. Dr. Hayes ordered films of her hips, knees, and spine, imaging that seemed excessive for a routine consultation. The technician positioned her for multiple views of each joint, explaining that Dr. Hayes likes to be thorough with senior patients. 20 minutes later, she was back in Dr. Hayes' office, watching him study her X-rays with theatrical intensity. His interpretation came quickly, too quickly for someone genuinely analyzing new images. The air conditioning hummed steadily, but Margaret felt perspiration gathering at her temples as something fundamental shifted in her understanding of the situation. Medical decisions should never be rushed. If a doctor pressures you into immediate surgery without allowing time for second opinions, that's a red flag. Trust your instincts. They could save your life. Margaret, I'm afraid the deterioration is more advanced than I'd hoped, he said, pointing to areas of her hip joints with his pen. Significant cartilage loss here and here. Without intervention, you're facing severe mobility limitation within months. Margaret studied the X-rays displayed on his computer screen. She'd never had formal training in radiology, but the images looked unremarkable to her untrained eye. Certainly nothing that suggested the catastrophic deterioration Dr. Hayes described. I don't experience hip pain, she said. My mobility is excellent. Pain isn't always the first indicator, he replied smoothly. By the time seniors notice significant discomfort, joint damage is often irreversible. We need to think proactively about maintaining your independence. Maintaining your independence. The phrase suggested that independence was something that could be preserved through medical intervention rather than personal capability and good fortune. What intervention are you recommending? Bilateral hip replacement, Dr. Hayes said, pulling up consent forms on his computer. The technology has advanced tremendously in recent years. Minimally invasive techniques, faster recovery times, excellent outcomes for patients in good health. Bilateral hip replacement. Major surgery on both hips for a woman experiencing no symptoms and no functional limitations. The recommendation seemed disproportionate to the supposed problem. Would you trust a doctor who recommends major surgery after 30 minutes? Like if you think Margaret should get a second opinion. That seems like an aggressive approach for someone without symptoms. Margaret at 70. 68, she corrected. At 68, your window for optimal surgical outcomes is limited. Waiting until symptoms develop means operating on patients with advanced joint damage and compromised healing capacity. Early intervention ensures the best possible results. The logic sounded rehearsed, like a sales presentation refined through repetition. Margaret had heard similar arguments from pharmaceutical representatives and medical device salespeople during her working years, carefully crafted appeals that emphasized urgency and limited opportunity. I'd like time to consider this recommendation. Of course, Dr. Hayes replied, but his tone suggested disappointment. However, my surgical schedule fills quickly. I have an opening next month that would be perfect for your first procedure. After that, we'd be looking at a 6-month wait. Next month, from consultation to major surgery in 4 weeks, a timeline that seemed designed to prevent careful consideration rather than facilitate informed decision-making. I'll need to discuss this with my family, Margaret said. Absolutely. Jenny seems very knowledgeable about medical issues. She'll understand the importance of timely intervention. Jenny. He'd referred to her daughter-in-law by first name, suggesting prior communication between them. Margaret wondered when and how they'd established that familiarity. As they concluded the appointment, Dr. Hayes handed her printed materials about hip replacement surgery and recovery timelines. The brochures were professionally produced, featuring testimonials from satisfied patients and statistics about surgical success rates. I'll have my office coordinator follow up about scheduling, he said, walking her to the reception area. The pre-authorization paperwork is already in process. Your insurance company will approve the procedures once we confirm surgical dates. Pre-authorization paperwork. In process before she'd agreed to surgery, based on a consultation that had lasted less than 30 minutes. The administrative efficiency suggested planning that preceded her examination. In the car afterward, Jenny's questions came rapidly. What had Dr. Hayes found? How serious was the joint damage? When could surgery be scheduled? Her eagerness felt inappropriate for someone supposedly concerned about a family member's welfare. He recommends bilateral hip replacement, Margaret said, studying Jenny's reaction. Jenny's face lit up with something that looked suspiciously like relief. That's wonderful news, Mom. Getting ahead of the problem before it becomes a crisis. When can he schedule the first procedure? I haven't agreed to surgery, Jennifer. This is a major medical decision that requires careful consideration. Jenny's expression darkened. Mom, Dr. Hayes is a specialist. He understands current surgical techniques and patient outcomes. Delaying necessary treatment could result in permanent disability. In my experience, good medical decisions aren't made under pressure. What experience? Jenny snapped, then caught herself. I mean, medical knowledge changes constantly. What seemed reasonable years ago might be dangerous today. Dr. Hayes represents current best practices in orthopedic care. Current best practices. Another clinical phrase delivered with the authority of someone who'd absorbed medical terminology without necessarily understanding its application. That evening, Margaret sat in her study considering the day's events. Dr. Hayes's recommendation felt premature, his timeline aggressive, his approach more focused on efficiency than patient care. The pre-authorization paperwork and insurance reviews suggested administrative preparation that preceded medical evaluation. Most troubling was Jenny's reaction, the relief when surgery was recommended, the pressure to accept treatment quickly, the dismissal of Margaret's desire for careful consideration. Her daughter-in-law's behavior suggested investment in the surgical recommendation that went beyond simple family concern. Tomorrow, Margaret would begin researching Dr. Richard Hayes more thoroughly. She would investigate his professional background, his surgical outcomes, his relationships with medical device companies and insurance providers. She would also explore alternatives to surgical intervention and seek opinions from other orthopedic specialists. Something about this entire situation felt orchestrated, and Margaret intended to understand who was orchestrating it and why before making any irreversible medical decisions. At 68, she'd earned the right to make informed choices about her own body, regardless of what others might consider appropriate or necessary. Margaret's attempt to research Dr. Hayes independently was interrupted by an unexpected visit from Michael and Jenny the following evening. They arrived with the determined expressions of people who'd rehearsed a difficult conversation, settling themselves in her living room with the gravity of family intervention. "Mom, we need to talk about your medical situation," Michael began, his voice carrying the strained patience of someone fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. At 42, her son had inherited his father's practical nature, but lacked Harold's warmth, particularly since remarrying 3 years after his first wife's death from cancer. "What medical situation?" Margaret asked, though she suspected the conversation would center on Dr. Hayes's surgical recommendation. "The joint deterioration," Jenny said, producing a folder of medical documents with theatrical precision. "Dr. Hayes called with additional information about your X-rays. The damage is progressing faster than initially estimated." "He called you directly?" "He called Michael at work yesterday," Jenny explained. "Professional courtesy. He wanted to ensure the family understood the urgency of intervention." Professional courtesy. Margaret found it unusual for a physician to contact family members without patient authorization, particularly to discuss private medical information. Such communication violated standard confidentiality protocols unless she'd signed releases she didn't remember completing. "What additional information?" she asked. Michael shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain about medical details, but committed to supporting his wife's position. Something about accelerated cartilage loss in seniors. He said delays could result in permanent disability. Accelerated cartilage loss. Another clinical phrase delivered without understanding, suggesting someone had coached Michael in terminology he couldn't explain or defend. He's moved up the recommended timeline for surgery, Jenny added, consulting her documents with professional efficiency. He had a cancellation in his schedule. He can fit you in next week. Next week. From consultation to major surgery in 10 days, a timeline that violated every principle of informed medical decision-making Margaret could imagine. Legitimate orthopedic surgery required weeks of preparation, medical clearance, preoperative planning, patient education, and careful consideration of alternatives. That's completely unreasonable, Margaret said. Major surgery requires adequate preparation and consideration time. Mom, you're overthinking this, Michael replied, his tone carrying the exasperation of someone who'd expected easier compliance. Dr. Hayes is the expert. If he says surgery is necessary, we should trust his professional judgment. Trust his professional judgment. Margaret wondered when her family had decided she was incapable of evaluating medical recommendations or making informed healthcare decisions. I haven't agreed to surgery. I'm seeking second opinions from other orthopedic specialists. Jenny's expression hardened. Mom, getting multiple opinions just delays necessary treatment. Dr. Hayes explained that window of opportunity for optimal surgical outcomes is limited. Waiting could mean operating under emergency conditions with compromised results. Emergency conditions. Margaret had experienced no symptoms, no functional limitations, no indication of medical emergency. The artificial urgency felt like manipulation rather than medical necessity. I've scheduled a consultation with Dr. Patricia Morrison at Presbyterian Hospital, Margaret said, naming an orthopedic surgeon she'd researched that afternoon. She's board-certified with excellent outcomes. Mom, you can't just shop around for doctors who tell you what you want to hear, Michael said, his frustration evident. That's dangerous at your age. Dangerous at your age, as if seeking multiple medical opinions became reckless rather than prudent after some arbitrary birthday. Jenny works in healthcare, Michael continued. She understands medical protocols and current best practices. We should listen to people who know about these things. People who know about these things. Margaret wondered when her son had decided she knew nothing about medical care or healthcare decision-making. Jenny leaned forward with the focused intensity of someone delivering crucial information. Mom, I need to share something with you. Michael and I have been discussing your long-term care needs. Long-term care needs. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. What needs? This house is too big for someone your age, Jenny said, glancing around the living room where Margaret had raised her family and built her life with Harold. The maintenance requirements, the isolation, the safety concerns. If you're going to need hip surgery, recovery would be much easier in a more manageable environment. Are you suggesting I sell my house? We're suggesting you consider assisted living arrangements, Michael said quietly. Somewhere with medical support, social activities, meal preparation. The recovery from bilateral hip replacement is extensive. You'd need help with daily activities for months. Assisted living arrangements. They'd progressed from scheduling medical appointments to discussing residential relocation, all based on surgery she hadn't agreed to for conditions she didn't have. I have no intention of moving to assisted living, Margaret said firmly. Mom, be realistic, Jenny replied, her professional demeanor slipping to reveal underlying impatience. You're 68 years old, recently widowed, isolated in a house that's becoming too much for you to maintain. Hip surgery will limit your mobility for months. You need professional care during recovery. Professional care. Margaret wondered what qualified Jenny to assess her care needs or determine her residential requirements. If I choose to have surgery, and that's a significant if, I can arrange for home healthcare assistance during recovery. Home healthcare is expensive and unreliable, Jenny countered quickly. Assisted living facilities provide comprehensive support with medical professionals on staff. Margaret noticed Jenny's immediate familiarity with assisted living costs and services, suggesting research that preceded their conversation. The level of planning implied decisions made without her input or consultation. You've already researched facilities? Michael and Jenny exchanged glances that confirmed Margaret's suspicion. We've explored options, Michael admitted. Golden Years Manor has an excellent reputation. Physical therapy on site, nursing staff available around the clock, social activities to prevent isolation. Golden Years Manor. They'd not only researched facilities but selected specific options, as if her residential future was their decision to make. Margaret's chest tightened with the crushing weight of decisions being made without her consent, her breathing becoming shallow as the walls of her own home seemed to close in around conversations about her future that excluded her voice. Is this elder abuse or family concern? What would you do in Margaret's situation? Share your thoughts. Elder financial abuse often begins with family members making decisions for your own good. If relatives are pressuring you about housing, medical care, or finances without respecting your autonomy, seek help from elder advocacy organizations. You have rights, regardless of your age. The timing would be perfect, Jenny added enthusiastically. You could move after surgery during initial recovery. The transition would be medically supervised with professional support. The timing would be perfect. For whom? Margaret wondered what made the timing perfect for her family while being catastrophic for her independence and autonomy. I'm not selling my house or moving to assisted living, Margaret said with the finality she'd once used to end arguments with difficult patients' families. Mom, you're being stubborn, Michael replied, his patience evidently exhausted. We're trying to help you make realistic decisions about your future. You can't live independently forever. Can't live independently forever. As if independence was a privilege that expired at some predetermined age, rather than a right to be maintained as long as capacity allowed. I'm living independently quite successfully at present. Are you, though? Jenny asked, pulling out her phone to consult notes she'd apparently prepared. When's the last time you saw friends socially? When did you last travel or engage in activities outside this house? You're becoming isolated, Mom. That's dangerous for seniors. Isolated. Margaret had chosen solitude during her grief process, finding peace in her own company and comfort in familiar surroundings. Jenny's interpretation of solitude as pathology felt like another attempt to pathologize normal responses to loss and aging. I socialize when I choose to socialize. I engage in activities that interest me. I'm not isolated. I'm selective. Selective isolation is still isolation, Jenny replied with the confidence of someone who'd memorized psychological terminology without understanding its application. The conversation continued for another hour, with Michael and Jenny presenting increasingly elaborate arguments for immediate surgery, residential relocation, and managed care. Their preparation was impressive, their coordination obvious, their determination concerning. What disturbed Margaret most was the underlying assumption that her preferences were irrelevant to decisions about her body, her home, her future. They spoke about her as if she were incapable of rational thought or informed decision-making, as if age had automatically transferred authority over her life to younger family members. After they left, Margaret sat in Harold's chair considering the evening's revelations. Her family was planning her future without her input, making decisions about her medical care without her consent, arranging her residential situation without her agreement. The coordination between medical recommendations and lifestyle changes suggested a comprehensive plan designed to transfer control of her life from herself to others. Someone was orchestrating this campaign, and Margaret suspected the coordination went beyond simple family concern. Tomorrow, she would keep her appointment with Dr. Patricia Morrison at Presbyterian Hospital. She would also contact her attorney to discuss protection strategies for people facing unwanted medical intervention and residential pressure from family members. At 68, she was apparently fighting for the right to make decisions about her own life. It was a battle she intended to win, regardless of who had decided she was too old, too isolated, or too stubborn to manage her own affairs appropriately. Something about this entire situation felt like a carefully orchestrated campaign to convince her she was incompetent, dependent, and in need of management by others. Margaret intended to understand who was behind that campaign and what they hoped to gain by convincing her she was unable to care for herself. Dr. Patricia Morrison's office at Presbyterian Hospital felt like stepping back into a familiar world Margaret had left 3 years ago. The institutional efficiency, the clinical precision, the underlying sense of serious purpose. Everything reminded her of the environment where she'd spent the most meaningful decades of her professional life. Dr. Sullivan, Patricia Morrison said, extending her hand with the firm grip of a surgeon accustomed to decisive action. It's an honor to meet you. Your reputation in orthopedic surgery preceded your retirement by many years. Margaret felt a jolt of recognition that went beyond simple professional courtesy. Dr. Morrison knew who she was, not as Michael's aging mother or Jenny's medical burden, but as Dr. Margaret Sullivan, former chief of orthopedic surgery at Presbyterian Hospital and past chair of the Medical Ethics Board. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, Dr. Morrison. Please, call me Patricia. And the notice wasn't short. Dr. Chen mentioned you might be seeking consultation. She speaks very highly of your clinical judgment and ethical standards. Dr. Chen, Margaret's former colleague and successor as Ethics Board Chair. Someone who remembered her professional expertise and personal integrity. I understand you've received a surgical recommendation from Dr. Richard Hayes. Bilateral hip replacement based on a 30-minute consultation and routine x-rays, Margaret replied, feeling the clinical precision of her own language returning naturally. The recommendation seemed disproportionate to my symptom profile. Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. Symptom profile? Asymptomatic. Full range of motion, no functional limitations, no pain or discomfort. Essentially, no clinical indication for surgical intervention. May I review your imaging studies? Margaret handed over the x-rays Dr. Hayes had provided, watching Patricia examine them with the systematic attention of someone trained to detect pathology rather than create it. The review took several minutes, far longer than Dr. Hayes had spent analyzing the same images. Dr. Sullivan, Patricia said finally, these films show minimal arthritic changes completely consistent with normal aging. There's no evidence of significant cartilage loss, joint space narrowing, or structural deterioration requiring surgical intervention. That was my assessment as well. Your assessment? Margaret felt something shift inside her, a return of professional confidence that had been systematically undermined by weeks of being treated as an incompetent elderly woman. The familiar weight of diagnostic responsibility settled across her shoulders like a surgeon's gown, and her voice found the authority that had once commanded operating rooms and ethics board hearings. Medical professionals. If you suspect a colleague is performing unnecessary procedures for financial gain, you have an ethical obligation to report it. Patient safety depends on our professional integrity and willingness to protect vulnerable populations. 35 years of orthopedic surgery. I retired as chief of service here 3 years ago. Patricia's expression transformed from polite professionalism to shocked recognition. My God, Dr. Hayes recommended unnecessary surgery to one of the most respected orthopedic surgeons in the state. Did you see that coming? Margaret is a distinguished surgeon. Comment if this reveal shocked you. Margaret felt the full weight of her professional identity returning. The knowledge, experience, and judgment that family pressure had temporarily obscured. She was not a confused elderly woman requiring medical management. She was Dr. Margaret Sullivan, a physician whose clinical expertise exceeded that of the surgeon who'd attempted to manipulate her into unnecessary procedures. Patricia, I need to ask you about Dr. Richard Hayes. What's his reputation in the orthopedic community? Patricia's expression grew careful, the diplomatic caution of a physician discussing a colleague. Dr. Hayes is controversial. His surgical volume has increased dramatically over the past 2 years. Some colleagues have expressed concerns about the necessity of certain procedures he performs. What kind of concerns? The usual issues with high-volume surgeons, operations on patients who might benefit from conservative management, billing patterns that raise questions. Nothing formally substantiated, but enough to make careful physicians uncomfortable. Margaret felt pieces of a disturbing puzzle beginning to align. Has the ethics board reviewed his practice patterns? Informally. There have been discussions about surgical appropriateness and patient selection criteria. But formal investigations require specific complaints and substantial evidence. What if I told you he recommended bilateral hip replacement for a patient with minimal arthritis and no symptoms? A patient with excellent insurance coverage and significant life insurance policies? Patricia's eyes widened as the implications became clear. That would constitute medical fraud, unnecessary surgery performed for financial gain rather than medical necessity. The patient also happens to be under family pressure to move to assisted living and transfer financial control to relatives who would benefit substantially from her death during surgery. Dr. Sullivan, what you're describing sounds like a coordinated conspiracy involving medical fraud and potential elder abuse. Margaret felt her professional instincts fully awakening for the first time since Harold's death. The systematic analysis, the pattern recognition, the ethical clarity that had defined her medical career, all returning with crystalline focus. Patricia, I need your help. Not as a patient seeking treatment, but as a colleague investigating potential medical fraud. What do you need? Access to Dr. Hayes' surgical statistics, complication rates, patient demographics, insurance billing patterns. The kind of data that would reveal whether he's systematically targeting elderly patients with good insurance for unnecessary procedures. Patricia nodded grimly. I can arrange access to peer review databases and surgical outcome registries. If Hayes is performing unnecessary surgery, the patterns will be evident in his statistics. I also need to understand his financial relationships with medical device manufacturers. Surgeons who perform high volumes of unnecessary procedures often receive substantial payments from equipment companies. The Sunshine Act requires disclosure of all physician payments from medical device manufacturers. Those records are public. Margaret felt her analytical mind engaging fully for the first time in months. The systematic approach to complex problems, the methodical accumulation of evidence, the careful construction of irrefutable conclusions, skills she'd developed over decades of medical practice and ethics board investigations. There's something else, she said. My daughter-in-law works as a medical office manager. She scheduled my appointment with Hayes, coordinated the insurance pre-authorization, and is now pressuring me to accept immediate surgery. She seems unusually knowledgeable about surgical scheduling and billing procedures. You think she's involved in the fraud? I think she may be the person coordinating it. Someone with her background would understand how to manipulate elderly patients through the healthcare system while ensuring maximum financial benefit for all parties involved. Patricia leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. Dr. Sullivan, if you're correct, we're looking at a conspiracy involving medical fraud, insurance fraud, and elder abuse. This goes far beyond medical ethics violations. Which is why I need to build an airtight case before taking any action. These people have convinced my own son that I'm an incompetent elderly woman whose judgment can't be trusted. If I'm going to stop them, I need evidence that's absolutely irrefutable. What's your plan? Margaret felt the strategic thinking that had made her an effective department chief and ethics board chair returning with full force. I'm going to let them think they're succeeding while I systematically document their fraud. I'll appear to accept the surgical recommendation while secretly building a case that will destroy their operation. That's dangerous. If they're willing to risk your life for financial gain, they won't hesitate to escalate pressure if they suspect you're investigating them. Which is why I need to be careful and systematic. I have advantages they don't know about: medical knowledge, professional connections, and the ability to understand their fraud from the inside. Patricia nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Professional backup. When I'm ready to expose this conspiracy, I'll need respected colleagues who can validate my findings and support my credibility. These people have spent weeks undermining my competence. I need the medical community to remember who I am. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, former chief of orthopedic surgery, past ethics board chair, pioneer in minimally invasive joint replacement. Your reputation in this hospital is unassailable. Margaret felt a surge of professional pride she hadn't experienced since retirement. She was not a confused elderly woman. She was a distinguished physician with the expertise to recognize medical fraud and the authority to stop it. I'll need access to Dr. Hayes' peer review data within the week, she said, her voice carrying the decisive tone that had once commanded operating rooms. I want surgical statistics, complication rates, patient demographics, and financial relationships with device manufacturers. I'll arrange that through the medical staff office. Anything else? Help me understand current protocols for reporting medical fraud to state licensing boards and federal investigators. I want to ensure my evidence meets prosecutorial standards. The medical board takes fraud investigations very seriously, especially when they involve unnecessary surgery. If your evidence is solid, they'll act quickly. Margaret stood to leave, feeling more confident than she had in months. The professional competence that family pressure had temporarily obscured was returning with full force, bringing clarity to what had seemed like an overwhelming situation. Patricia, thank you for reminding me who I am. Dr. Sullivan, thank you for trusting me with this information. If Dr. Hayes is systematically defrauding elderly patients, stopping him could prevent serious harm to vulnerable people. As Margaret left Presbyterian Hospital, she felt the transformation from vulnerable widow to professional investigator complete itself. She had work to do, important work that required all the skills and knowledge she'd developed over 35 years of medical practice. Jenny and Michael thought they were manipulating a confused elderly woman. They had no idea they were attempting to defraud one of the most respected orthopedic surgeons in the state, a physician with the expertise to recognize their fraud and the professional connections to destroy their operation completely. Tomorrow, she would begin building the case that would expose their conspiracy and protect other elderly patients from similar exploitation. For the first time since Harold's death, Dr. Margaret Sullivan had a mission worthy of her capabilities and a purpose that demanded her full professional engagement. The hunt was about to begin. Margaret's transformation from vulnerable target to systematic investigator began at 5:30 a.m. the following morning, the same time she'd once risen for hospital rounds. Her study, dormant since retirement, hummed with the focused energy of a physician building a case that would save lives and destroy careers. The data Patricia Morrison had provided painted a damning picture of Dr. Richard Hayes' practice patterns. In 2 years, his surgical volume had increased by 400%, with elderly patients comprising 78% of his procedures. Most disturbing was the pattern of bilateral joint replacements performed on patients over 65, a surgical approach typically reserved for severe arthritis or traumatic injury. Unnecessary surgery, Margaret murmured, reviewing case summaries that detailed procedures performed on patients with minimal symptoms and excellent conservative treatment options. Systematic medical fraud. Her phone rang at precisely 7 a.m. Dr. James Morrison from the Insurance Fraud Investigation Unit at the State Medical Board, responding to her request for consultation about suspicious billing patterns. Dr. Sullivan, Patricia Morrison forwarded your concerns about Dr. Hayes. I've been tracking his practice for 6 months based on anonymous complaints from other physicians. What have you found? Billing irregularities, patient selection bias toward those with premium insurance, and coordination with medical device sales representatives that suggests financial incentives beyond standard professional relationships. Margaret felt her investigative instincts sharpen. Financial incentives? Dr. Hayes received $847,000 in payments from orthopedic device manufacturers last year, consultancy fees, speaking honoraria, and research grants. For a physician in solo practice, that's an extraordinary amount. $847,000, nearly $1 million in payments from companies whose products he implanted in patients during unnecessary surgeries. The financial motive was overwhelming. Dr. Morrison, I need to share something confidential. I believe Dr. Hayes is part of a larger conspiracy involving my daughter-in-law, who works as a medical office manager. She's been coordinating my path toward unnecessary surgery while simultaneously pressuring me to transfer financial control to family members. A pause. Dr. Sullivan, what you're describing sounds like organized elder abuse with medical fraud as the mechanism. Do you have evidence of coordination between Dr. Hayes and your family members? I'm building that evidence systematically. But I need to understand something. If a patient died during unnecessary surgery, would that constitute homicide under state law? If the surgery was medically unjustified and performed for financial gain, yes. Prosecutors have successfully pursued murder charges against physicians who caused patient deaths through fraudulent procedures. Murder charges. Margaret felt a chill as she realized how close she'd come to becoming a victim of what amounted to attempted homicide disguised as medical care. Her second call went to David Martinez, her attorney, who specialized in healthcare fraud and elder abuse cases. Margaret, I've been researching your situation since our last conversation, David said. I pulled financial records on your son Michael and his wife Jennifer. They're in serious trouble. Underwater mortgage, credit card debt exceeding $200,000, facing foreclosure within 60 days. $200,000 in debt, facing foreclosure. The financial desperation provided clear motive for accelerating Margaret's death to access life insurance proceeds. David, there's more. I've discovered that Dr. Hayes is systematically performing unnecessary surgery on elderly patients for financial gain. Jenny appears to be coordinating referrals to him while pressuring families toward surgical decisions. That's conspiracy to commit fraud. If you died during surgery, it could be conspiracy to commit murder. Margaret, you need protection while building this case. What kind of protection? Legal documentation establishing your mental competence, revocation of any medical authorizations you didn't knowingly sign, and formal notification to hospitals about potential fraud attempts involving your care. Margaret spent the next hour signing documents that established her legal competence and revoked any medical authorizations obtained through misrepresentation. The paperwork felt like armor against further manipulation attempts. Her third call went to Dr. A. Patricia Chen, her former colleague and current ethics board chair. Margaret, thank God you called. I've been investigating Dr. Hayes based on your information. We found something disturbing. He's been accessing medical records for elderly patients before they're referred to him. Someone's providing him with insurance information and health data prior to initial consultations. Someone like a medical office manager with access to patient databases? Exactly. The access logs show queries from Riverside Family Practice, where your daughter-in-law works. She's been pulling records for potential surgical candidates and forwarding information to Dr. Hayes. Electronic evidence. Digital trails that proved coordination between Jenny and Dr. Hayes in selecting elderly patients for unnecessary surgery. The conspiracy was documented in computer logs and billing records. Patricia, I need you to freeze Dr. Hayes' access to all hospital databases immediately, and I want security protocols established for any medical records with my name attached. Consider it done. Margaret, you've uncovered a major fraud operation. How many other elderly patients has this woman targeted? The question haunted Margaret as she continued her investigation. How many vulnerable seniors had Jenny identified as surgical candidates? How many had undergone unnecessary procedures? How many had died during operations they didn't need for conditions they didn't have? Her final call of the morning went to Detective Lisa Rodriguez at the State Police Financial Crimes Unit, recommended by David Martinez as the officer who specialized in healthcare fraud investigations. Dr. Sullivan, I've been briefed on your situation by Mr. Martinez. We'd like to set up a controlled investigation using you as a cooperative witness. Are you willing to wear recording devices during conversations with the suspected conspirators? What would that involve? We document their continued attempts to pressure you into surgery while building evidence of fraud and conspiracy. The recordings would be admissible in criminal court and civil proceedings. Margaret felt the weight of the decision. Becoming a cooperative witness meant continuing the charade of being a vulnerable target, while secretly documenting evidence that could send her own family members to prison. Detective Rodriguez, how many other cases like this have you investigated? Dozens. Elder financial abuse often involves medical fraud as the mechanism. Family members coordinate with corrupt healthcare providers to accelerate inheritance through unnecessary procedures. It's more common than people realize. What's the conviction rate? When we have solid evidence, recordings, financial documentation, medical records, nearly 100%. Juries don't tolerate schemes that endanger elderly people for financial gain. Margaret made her decision with the clinical certainty that had defined her surgical career, her pulse steady and determined as it had been before entering operating rooms where lives hung in the balance. If you're an elderly person facing pressure for unnecessary medical procedures, you're not powerless. Contact your state medical board, consult with independent physicians, and trust your instincts. Your life and autonomy are worth protecting. I'll cooperate fully. These people need to be stopped before they kill someone. Excellent. We'll meet tomorrow to set up recording equipment and plan your next interactions with the suspects. Dr. Sullivan, you're potentially saving lives by taking this action. As afternoon shadows lengthened across her study, Margaret reviewed the evidence she'd accumulated in one morning of systematic investigation. Financial motives, documented fraud patterns, electronic trails, and professional testimony. A comprehensive case that would destroy the conspiracy threatening her life. Jenny and Michael thought they were manipulating a confused elderly woman. They had no idea they were attempting to defraud a distinguished physician with the expertise to recognize their crime and the professional connections to ensure their prosecution. Tomorrow, she would begin the final phase of her investigation, gathering direct evidence of conspiracy while wearing recording devices that would capture every word of their criminal planning. The hunt was entering its most dangerous phase, but Dr. Margaret Sullivan was ready for the challenge. For the first time since Harold's death, she felt truly alive, engaged in work that mattered, using skills that had been dormant too long, fighting a battle she was uniquely qualified to win. The attempted victim was about to become the prosecutor, and the predators would soon discover they'd chosen the wrong prey. 3 weeks later, Margaret sat in her study reviewing transcripts of recorded conversations that would destroy the conspiracy threatening her life and countless other elderly patients. The digital recorder Detective Rodriguez had provided captured every word of Jenny and Michael's criminal planning with prosecutorial clarity. Mom agreed to the surgery. Michael's voice played back through high-quality speakers. Hayes can schedule it for next week. Perfect! Jenny's response carried unmistakable satisfaction. Once she's under anesthesia, anything could happen. Complications during hip surgery aren't unusual in patients her age. They were planning to kill her during surgery. Have you seen medical fraud in your family? Tell us below. Anything could happen. Margaret felt cold satisfaction as she listened to her daughter-in-law essentially planning her murder, recorded with digital precision that would be admissible in criminal court. The investigation had exceeded her most optimistic expectations. Detective Rodriguez's team had identified 12 other elderly patients Jenny had referred to Dr. Hayes for unnecessary surgery. 3 had died from complications during procedures they didn't need for conditions they didn't have. 3 murders disguised as medical care. Dr. Sullivan? Patricia Chen's voice interrupted her review. The medical board is ready for your testimony. Margaret looked up from her transcripts to see Patricia standing in her doorway with Dr. James Morrison and Detective Rodriguez. The formal hearing that would destroy Dr. Hayes' medical career was about to begin. Are you ready for this? Detective Rodriguez asked, checking her recording equipment one final time. I've been ready for 35 years, Margaret replied, feeling the full weight of her professional authority returning. Let's end this. The medical board hearing convened at Presbyterian Hospital in the same conference room where Margaret had once chaired ethics investigations. The irony felt appropriate. The physician who had spent a decade protecting patients from medical fraud was about to expose the most systematic conspiracy she'd ever encountered. Dr. Hayes sat across the conference table with his attorney, his confident demeanor cracking as Margaret entered the room. He'd expected to face a confused elderly woman making vague accusations. Instead, he confronted one of the most respected physicians in the state, armed with irrefutable evidence of his crimes. Dr. Hayes, Margaret began, her voice carrying the authority that had once commanded operating rooms. You recommended bilateral hip replacement for a patient with minimal arthritis and no symptoms. Care to explain your clinical reasoning? Mrs. Sullivan's imaging studies showed significant deterioration requiring surgical intervention, he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Dr. Sullivan, Margaret corrected coldly, and my imaging studies showed minimal arthritic changes completely normal for my age. I should know. I've interpreted thousands of similar X-rays during 35 years of orthopedic practice. The room fell silent as board members processed the revelation. Dr. Hayes had attempted medical fraud against one of their most distinguished colleagues. Furthermore, Margaret continued producing financial disclosure documents. You received $847,000 from medical device manufacturers last year while performing unnecessary surgery on elderly patients. Explain how those payments didn't influence your surgical recommendations. Dr. Hayes' attorney leaned forward. Dr. Sullivan, my client's financial relationships with medical device companies are entirely legitimate. Your client, Margaret interrupted with surgical precision, conspired with my daughter-in-law to manipulate elderly patients into unnecessary surgery for financial gain. We have recorded conversations documenting their criminal coordination. Detective Rodriguez activated the audio equipment, filling the conference room with Jenny's voice, planning Margaret's death during surgery she didn't need. The recording continued for 20 minutes, documenting conspiracy, fraud, and premeditated murder with devastating clarity. When the audio ended, the silence stretched uncomfortably long. Dr. Hayes sat pale and defeated, realizing the full scope of evidence arrayed against him. Dr. Hayes, the board chairman said finally, your medical license is hereby suspended pending criminal investigation. You are barred from practicing medicine in this state effective immediately. Margaret felt satisfaction deeper than any she'd experienced during her surgical career. Professional justice delivered with the precision that had defined her decades of medical practice. The criminal proceedings moved with remarkable speed. Jenny and Michael were arrested the following morning, charged with conspiracy to commit murder, medical fraud, and elder abuse. Jenny's access to patient databases had provided prosecutors with evidence of 12 additional elderly victims targeted for unnecessary surgery. Dr. Hayes pled guilty to medical fraud and conspiracy charges, receiving a 20-year prison sentence and permanent revocation of his medical license. His cooperation with prosecutors revealed a network of corrupt physicians and medical office managers operating similar schemes across 3 states. Jenny received 15 years for conspiracy to commit murder and elder financial abuse. Michael, whose cooperation led to additional prosecutions, was sentenced to 8 years for conspiracy and fraud. Margaret's house remained her home, her independence intact, her medical care under her own informed control. More importantly, the investigation she'd initiated protected countless other elderly patients from similar exploitation. 6 months after the trials concluded, Margaret received a call from Dr. Patricia Chen. "Margaret, the medical board wants to offer you a consulting position in healthcare fraud investigation. Your expertise could help us identify and prevent similar conspiracies." Margaret considered the offer while sitting in Harold's chair, watching afternoon light filter through windows of the home she'd fought to keep. At 68, she could begin a new career protecting vulnerable patients from the kind of predators who had nearly destroyed her life. "Patricia, I accept. When do we start?" "How about Monday morning? We have 17 cases that could benefit from your analytical expertise." As she hung up the phone, Margaret felt the deep satisfaction of purpose regained. The vulnerable widow was gone, replaced by Dr. Margaret Sullivan, physician, investigator, and protector of patients who couldn't protect themselves. Her reflection in the window showed not the uncertain woman her family had tried to manipulate, but the confident professional who had dedicated her life to healing and protection. Elder abuse can happen to anyone, but knowledge and community support provide powerful protection. If this story resonated with you, share it with others who might benefit from understanding the warning signs. Together, we can protect our most vulnerable community members from those who would exploit their trust. Her professional life had ended with retirement 3 years ago. Today, it was beginning again with work that mattered more than anything she'd done in operating rooms. The attempted victim had become the prosecutor, and the predators would face justice for crimes against the most vulnerable members of society. In her study that evening, Margaret reviewed case files for Monday's consulting work. 17 elderly patients potentially facing unnecessary surgery, their lives depending on her ability to recognize fraud and protect them from medical predators. Justice served. Should more families be protected from medical fraud? Subscribe for more stories of seniors fighting back. She'd never felt more useful, more engaged, or more grateful for the expertise that made such protection possible. At 68, Dr. Margaret Sullivan was saving more lives than ever. Not through surgery, but through the systematic application of medical knowledge and professional integrity to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The conspiracy that nearly killed her had inadvertently given her the most meaningful work of her career, and tomorrow she would begin again.